Welcome after Shavuos. We've just received the Torah, so to speak, and you're back to get some more. So here we go. This week is Parshas Naso. Already in Israel, they're already doing Parshas Bahaloscha. And what I've decided to speak about today is the Nazir, because I find that very intriguing. The Nazarite, the person who takes a Nazarite vow. First of all, with your permission, I would like to dedicate the learning today for the Rafuf Shalema, for someone who's having an operation right now. Michael David Ben Devora, may he have a Rafuf Shalema. Another person who's having an operation today called Esther Bas Shoshana. And I always like to dedicate the learning Torah Le'ilu Nishmas, my mother-in-law, Bruria Bas Shlomo, who passed away on Hanukkah. Now, don't look at your sheet yet, because there's nothing you can hide. It's not like that. It's just that in the first two sources, I don't want to have it more than 4 pages. Do you know what I mean? I have to try and squash it in. In Vayikra, famously, we are taught in Parshas Kadoshim Tihiyu. We should be holy. So all the Mefarshim there say, what does be holy mean? No, come in, Deborah. Rashi there says, Kadoshim, how is a person holy? How can you become holy? Heve perushim min ha'arayas or min ha'avera. A person, I'm going to pass this, go on. Oh, you two haven't got a sheet. A person should separate themselves from sin. Here, smell that. A person should separate themselves from sin or immorality. That's what we speak about at the beginning. So Kadoshim Tihiyu, separate yourself. Kadoshim Tihiyu, Rashi says, how do we understand what holiness is? Wherever we find a barrier or some form of separation, we find holiness. And in this week's parasha, we hear about the Nazir. And I find the whole concept most intriguing. I just want you to know that there was a Nazir who, even in my lifetime, just about, he passed away in 1972. He was known as Rav HaNazir. His name was David Cohen, and he was a disciple of Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, if anyone wants to look it up. And his daughter married Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was the rabbi of the IDF. I'm thinking about Yom Yerushalayim, we were just speaking about that before. And his son was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Haifa, Rabbi Shayash of Cohen, and he took a Nazarite vow. Somebody told me, I don't know enough about it, about what the practical levels are today, but we're told in the Torah that at the end of the person's term of being a Nazir, a person has to give a sacrifice. So how can you make a term of being a Nazir? Because how do you end it? Because we can't offer up a sacrifice. But I don't know enough about it, so I don't suggest anybody takes a Nazarite vow now, but I don't know enough about it. So let's look together. Source 1, Bamidbar. We're just going to skim through it. We're not going to go too much into the details. Yeah, already a question. Fantastic. Jane.
Was it just reserved for men?
We're going to see. That's my first, it's in the first posuk. If you would let me get there, second posuk, it's coming up, okay? This is Hashem speaking in Parshas Naso. I had to choose. There were so many things to choose from in Parshas Naso. Yeah, I'm going to get there. We're going to get there. Okay, so we've got to translate it. And I'm especially saying Nazir because I don't want to translate it yet. Okay. Daber el bnei Yisrael va'amata alehem. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Ish o Isha, a man or a woman, so both could be a man or a woman, thank you for preempting that, Jane. Ki yafli, I'm not going to translate the word yafli, who does something, yafli. Lindor neder, to vow a vow, Nazir, to make themselves a Nazir, we're going to discuss what that is in a second. Lahazir lahashem, to become a Nazir to Hashem. And I'm going to explain what a Nazir is as we go along. And here are the rules. Number 3. Source 1, Posuk Gimel. Bamidbar Perek Vav. Miyayin v'secha yazir chometz, yayin chometz secha lo yishteh. You shall abstain from wine and any other intoxicating drink. They shall not even drink wine vinegar. V'kol mishras anovim, thank you, lo yishteh anovim. They shouldn't even drink anything from which grapes have been soaked and sat there. He shouldn't eat, not even raisins or grapes or fresh grapes or anything.
Were they finished on Friday night?
Well, that is a good question. I don't know. Good question. I don't know.
4 cups, yeah.
I don't know, but a person typically would have made themselves a Nazir for a specific period of time. Usually 30 days, usually it should be 30 days period. Some people, and according to in the Torah, there are examples of people who are a Nazir. We're going to talk about what a Nazir is in a second, so Gabriella, bear with me. Shimshon was a Nazir, and right up till his death, although he did cut his hair, we'll talk about cutting hair in 1 second. Perhaps Yosef, Shmuel, it's argued that they were also a Nazir, yeah.
How was the term set? Did they set it personally?
Yeah, they themselves decided. We're gonna talk about it. I'm gonna get there. You can ask me as many questions as you like, but we will cover it today. Okay. Okay. All the days of their term as a Nazir, kol yemei nizro, mikol asher ye'oseh migefen hayayin. They must not eat anything obtained from the grapevine, not seeds or skin. Posuk hey, kol yemei neder nizro, ta'ar lo ya'avo al rasho. They are not allowed to cut their hair. A razor is not allowed to go on their head. Now, apparently, you can imagine if someone was a Nazir for a very long time, their hair would have been very unruly. Think about a little girl who's 5 years old and doesn't ever want to cut her hair, although she's got very soft baby sort of virgin hair. But they were allowed to do something like this with their fingers to smooth out their hair. And sorry? It's very interesting you say that, because it is interesting. We talk about hair being holy, or for example, think back to even Victorian times. Most women covered their hair, or gentlemen covered their hair, and raising your hat, popes cover their hair. All interesting about covering your hair. And apparently, even the Nazir, who was a Nazir for a long time, was allowed to cut their hair once every year, but there's difference of opinion about whether that was like that. And their hair shall be consecrated, kept holy until the completion of their term as a Nazir to Hashem, the hair of their head being left to grow untrimmed. Posuk Vav, Kol Yemei Haziro Lashem Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yovo. The third thing, so we've got the first two things, you mustn't eat any product of grapevine. I shouldn't say the shop called grapevine, nothing's wrong with the shop called grapevine. You mustn't eat anything from any grape. Or any intoxicating drink, according to different opinions. As I'm not going to take on this vow, it's not going to be so relevant to me, but there is a whole section of the Gemara called Nazir, and there's plenty written about it. But we're not going to go anywhere near that, because I don't think it's going to be practical for us today. Okay, all the days, throughout the term they have set apart for Hashem, they shall not go anywhere near where there's a dead person. So, al nefesh meis lo yovo. They're not allowed to go near a dead person, a corpse. Zion, la'oviv u'le'imo u'la'ochiv u'la'choso lo yitama lahem. He's not even allowed to go if somebody dies for his own father, mother, brother, or sister. I'll put in brackets. We understand that to mean a sister who's not married. A sister who's married doesn't come under that umbrella. Kineze elokov al rasho, because he has set himself apart, and the word Nazir is sort of done to him. He has taken this upon himself. Now, what we're going to talk about today is why would someone do this? What would prompt them? And then the other thing, which is what I'm going to focus on mainly today, is it good or not? So I called it sinner or a saint. So there's obviously going to be a lot of discussion whether or not we think it's a good thing or a bad thing. But before we get onto the discussion, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing...
Please could Miss Dowhite come to the office? There's a call.
Oh, that's exciting.
Okay. Forbids me from asking anything from the school because she doesn't want to be called.
Okay. Okay.
It's terrible.
Okay, we can't... No, we're recording. Move on. Okay, just want to say one thing is a lot of the commentators speak about the fact about how similar it is for the Nazir compared to another character in the Torah, not a person. Kohen Gadol, thank you, Mickey. Similar to the laws of the Kohen Gadol, Kohanim, we know practically if someone is a Kohen today, even if someone has a baby. My husband's not a Kohen, but my niece is married to a Kohen, so he's very careful. He doesn't even drive past the cemetery in Hoop Lane, so he shouldn't be within proximity of a dead body. A Kohen at a funeral would keep himself apart on the other side of the road, or Kohanim are buried traditionally at the edge of the cemetery, so that the Kohanim, if they have to go and visit their own parents or siblings or mother, mother, father, whatever, then, or God forbid, a child, they are buried at the edge of the cemetery so that they shouldn't have to sort of, in inverted commas, expose themselves. There's all sorts of halachic. There's halachic discussions about what they should do in a hospital, because obviously there's a morgue. And there's all sorts of discussions. I remember there was a whole discussion about the flight path on the El Al planes. Do you remember all that?
Oh, yeah.
And apparently there was like a joke. Someone put like him in a tin foil or something. I don't know what these things are, but I don't know enough about it.
A Kohen who wanted to become a surgeon, and he had to ask a shaila about that, and that was quite complicated.
I'm sure there are difficulties, but we're not. Our topic for today is not Kohen. It's just a little tangential thing. So a Kohen shouldn't come into the roofed space of a cemetery, except just want to say for a mace mitzvah. If anyone wants to read all about it, I found an article. It's about mace mitzvah, about hospitals and things like that. The interesting thing is that a Kohen Gadol shouldn't become Tomei with any contact with a dead person, even his own family. But the Kohen is allowed to, not only is allowed to, he must cut his hair. A Kohen has to be, he is almost like a public persona, and he shouldn't have like a disheveled look about him. He should have his hair, and the Levim had to have their hair shaved, and the Kohen Gadol had to be shaved. But I do want to say something that I saw that's quite interesting, is the Kohen used to wear something on his head, which is really interesting, with the words, it was called a tzitz, a gold band, and it said on it, Kadosh Lashem, which is really interesting because that phrase is used within the Nazir. But perhaps a person who is a Nazir is, in inverted commas, a private individual, even if he is a community person. The Kohen Gadol holds public office and therefore has to wear the right clothes, has to wear as befitting to his honor, he should wear the right sort of clothing. So he has to have a respectable appearance. But maybe this Kadosh Lashem on his head, perhaps the Nazir with his hair on his head, is similar. So I just want, before we talk about a Nazir, by the way, in modern Hebrew, the word Nazir is translated as a monk. So interesting. So how do we define Nazir? Going back to the questions that I was asked before, a person who takes themselves a vow, and at the end of their vow, they have to offer a sacrifice. We'll speak about that later on. And they have to not eat any grapes, drink grape juice, any intoxicating beverages made from the grape. Maybe they're allowed to have other types of intoxicating beverages. Maybe it's just grapes. And he's not allowed to cut his hair. He or she are not allowed to cut their hair, and they're not allowed to come into contact with a dead body. If, for some reason, let's say, God forbid, someone takes this vow, and during this vow, they have to, like one of their parents passes away, and it's really awful. Yeah, so that's all sorts of issues. Yeah. If she was next to someone and someone just dropped dead, you don't have to be not celibate. It's not celibacy.
No, but you don't have to remove yourself from society.
No. The rabbi I told you about, he already had children, but I don't know whether he took the vow. I think he had children. He took the vow in World War I. It's not celibacy, which is really interesting because you think
that's celibacy. Just remove himself for a specific amount of time from.
I don't think they have to separate themselves. I think they have to take on these things. To be honest, there's a lot of information about it, and there's also lots of different opinions about it. And as it's not so practical for today, as I told you, there was this man who passed away in 1972 who was a famous Nazir. You could Google his name, David Cohen Nazir. He was called Rav HaNazir. So interesting, but because we know about him, because he was so exceptional. But the problem is, if someone took this vow, and then in the period of this 30 days, whilst they had the vow, then what happens? So then they would have to redo the vow. They would have to start again, so to speak. And there's a story in the Gemara about a queen who took it on, and then she said, I'm going to be a Nazir for 7 years. Then she got contaminated, so she carried on her term for the next 7 years. So before I start and look at the sources, before we turn the page and get into the meat of this, I just want to know, do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? That's the title of the talk. Sinner or saint? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it's
I think it's a good thing.
I don't understand the purpose.
Yeah.
Okay. You think it's neither?
Choice.
Yeah.
They want to.
You're not harming anyone else?
Exactly.
Yeah, good thing. I think good thing.
You think it's a good thing? To separate yourself, not drink wine?
There's no command.
I don't drink wine anyway.
You don't drink wine?
There's no command. It's an unusual thing to
Yes,
just decide
but
to do.
once a year.
There's no command. I don't understand the point of it.
Okay.
To become purer, to...
It's not pure.
We're gonna
It doesn't
talk-
feel like a Jewish concept if it's not commanded.
Right, so we have like, in Islam, we have like Sufism, where people sort of like decide for themselves they're going to grow their hair, retract from society.
Is it a form of meditation?
Don't know.
But it's only for short periods. Not
But you
for
could be
long
forever. You could say I do it for 5 years.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm saying as a minimum term is 30 days.
So they set the
I
term
don't think it's
themselves.
They set the term themselves.
I
Okay.
don't think it's a
Well, we'll talk about why someone would do this in a minute and whether or not what the rabbis say, whether it's a good or bad thing. I've got a feeling, Gabrielle, did you want to say something?
No, I'm just thinking, I'm not quite sure how much of a sacrifice it actually is, because it doesn't say you should become socially withdrawn.
But maybe if you, I just don't know how often people cut their hair in antiquity because we didn't have the local hairdresser, did you?
Not to have your hair cut and not to drink wine isn't such a huge sacrifice, is it? I mean, I
Not
have
to
my
be
hair
like
cut.
once a
Okay,
year.
can I just say something about it? Is that
Drink wine.
in antiquity, if you think about it, not everybody had access to fresh water, and probably most drinks they had were fermented drinks because they didn't have access to fresh. I'm just thinking about it myself. Madeline, I'm sure you've got something to say.
In today's terms, you
Sorry.
would have to sacrifice so much more in order to comply.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, this is the terms that they set then, but nowadays, if you want to be a modern day Nazir, you would have much broader restrictions in order to...
I don't understand what I don't understand what you're saying. Is you're saying that's what you think a Nazir should have.
I'm just saying that if we were to apply this in modern day times, we would have much larger, much broader restrictions rather than just not cutting your hair and not drinking wine.
But in antiquity, it doesn't say, for example, that they should be celibate or they have to separate from society. So, are you like making a suggestion of what you think should be?
No, I'm just saying that it doesn't seem to us to be
appropriate
such
for now.
a huge sacrifice
Okay.
to have made in order to become a Nazir for say 30 days.
Well, for me, I don't ever drink wine, so
I mean,
it's
it
like
could be, you know,
There's
well,
no
like
alcohol
people do
at
for
all.
Lent, people give up.
No, it's
Much
only
more.
from wine. You can
Yeah.
have whiskey, you can
yeah,
have
yeah.
arak. You can
And
have
any other intoxicants.
Okay, but we have to look at what it is in Hebrew.
What is any other intoxicant?
Okay.
Oh, then you
Any
can't have
grape,
whiskey.
any other, any. So chometz secha no, because that would be chometz would be vinegar. Secha would be alcoholic beverage. I don't know exactly what it. There must be pages and pages of what it means and how it does. I don't know the answer, but I do agree with what you're saying, Gabriella. That I think that if for us it's like thinking like what's so hot. I don't know, but you have to think if in antiquity everyone drank wine. Sorry. Not unruly hair? Well, if you only have it for 30 days, it's not so terrible, let's be honest.
But if you're a woman, it's easy because you just tie it
But
back.
hold on, you're making an assumption that in antiquity men cut their hair.
No, but that's why I mentioned Sikhs before, not just that they didn't cut their hair, but they actually have a way of keeping their hair looking tidy.
Men do as well at the moment.
Yeah.
So whether they did in that time as well, they would have had something where it's covered.
Jane, are you going to say something?
I've forgotten now.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
It just seems to me there's a lot of restrictions in Judaism, and why impose more?
Right, hold that thought, and I hope we get there, because that's what we've got a lovely source for that. Right, Madeline, go.
I'm against it,
You're against it.
and pretty much for the same reason that changes. No, I mean, the impulse behind it is that one wants to dedicate oneself to Hashem more than the average person will dedicate themselves to Hashem. And there's plenty that one can do within the Arba Amos of ordinary halacha. If you want to dedicate yourself to Hashem, you don't have to do it in a very, you can do it in a more modest way. You don't have to do it in a way that makes it immediately obvious that this person is an Nazir and he is dedicated.
But you don't know, because you could cut your hair today and then say, right, tonight I'm starting to become a Nazir. So for 30 days, people cut their hair all the time. I don't know. I don't know the answers. But anyway,
It's not just about cutting hair, it's about restricting yourself from alcoholic beverages and not attending funerals or anything of this.
so you are maybe perhaps retreating from society. And if you look disheveled, perhaps you are stepping back. Jane was going to say something.
It just seems very a self thing. It's not doing good to anybody else.
Lovely.
Yeah,
Okay.
Not helping anybody else.
I'm so special. What's so, what?
Okay, but anyone can take it upon themselves. Okay, so let's
Shimshon excluded because Shimshon's mother was
took on the vow.
He didn't actually have a choice in that.
No, correct.
So I think we have to exclude Shimshon from the equation.
Okay, I'm going to move on because
Why
otherwise...
Hashem wanted him to be a Nazir is another
I don't know, but it's an interesting concept, and maybe whatever we can learn from, what I'd like to get to today is what we can learn from it in terms of our practical levels. So first thing I want to talk about is Rashi. Rashi says wherever the term Nazir occurs, it means separating from something. Ein Nazira b'kol makom elo parisha, separating. Okay, and here a person has to separate a bit from society, from wine, from dead bodies, and from having haircuts. And Rashi says to separate from wine. Ibn Ezra, on the word yafli, I didn't want to translate it, which is in verse 1. Yafli could come from the word pele, like pelephon, wonder. Oh, it's an absolute wondrous thing to do, that Ibn Ezra says. And the Targum says, ki yafli means you have to actually say it. You can't in your brain think, oh, I'm going to be a Nazir. You actually have to say, I take on the Nazirite vow. I am now going to become a Nazir. And then Rashi comments on what's yafli means to separate yourself. Yafrish, he should separate himself. Or he or she. It's always he or she because it's both masculine and feminine, as per we discussed with Jane just a short while ago. Now, this is what Rashi says. Lama nismecha parsha Nazir la parsha sota. Why does Nazir come straight after Sota? Now, Sota is the lady who is accused of adultery, and her husband says, do not seclude yourself with this man, and then she secludes herself with this man. Doesn't matter whether anything went on or didn't go on, and then she gets basted and has to have Hashem's name erased. She drinks this liquid, and were she to be guilty, then her insides would come out. And if she's not guilty, this is my best bit, then she gets a special blessing that she will have children. I find that very, very troubling, but Sota is not our topic for today. So a person, look what Rashi says. Why is it next to Sota? To tell you, lo malacha shekol haro'eh Sota bikilula in her disgrace, yazir atzmo min hayayin. A person who sees the Sota, is debatable if there ever was a Sota story ever happened, or is it hypothetical. They might think to themselves, oh my goodness me, I never want to put myself in a situation where I get to adultery, which is really interesting because a Nazir does not have to be celibate. But I think the point is, maybe wine or any intoxicant is causing a little bit of a problem, and I need to think to myself, ooh, I don't want that to ever happen to me. I need to sort of put the brakes on in my life. Now, I don't
make it a sin to be drunk.
Sorry, no, not to be drunk, but maybe if you become drunk, then you're a little bit lost control.
No, absolutely, but that's why, as a woman, I would never ever do that. But to abstain from wine completely, maybe you should say that you should always abstain from wine, because if you get drunk, you run the risk. So shouldn't that be
good? Lovely. We're going to talk about. Get that. I can already see it's very hot.
If you are abstaining from wine because you've seen a sota, people may believe that you are. If you're a Nazir, people may suddenly think, maybe it's because they've seen a sota. So maybe you may come across as being a sota or someone who's seen a sota when you're just being a Nazir as well. So again,
Right, you mean by incriminating themselves, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could give the incorrect impression that actually you are either a sota or someone who's seen a sota when you're being
Really interesting that you say that, but what he actually says is Yazir atzmo min hayayin should think to himself, maybe the sota or the man she was with, or secluded himself with, they got carried away somehow because they were under the influence of alcohol. The question is, what is going on and what happens? And at the end of the period that a person is a sota, I say it could be a lady or a man. I've missed out a few pasukim, but we will go back to one in the middle. In the pasuk Yud Gimel Yud Dalet, Zos Toras HaNazir b'yom meloos yemei nizro yovi oso el Pesach ol Moed. At the end of the term that the person is completed, their Nazir time, they should be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed. V'hikriv es korbono l'Hashem, and they should bring a korban to Hashem. Keves, and that's what it is. It's a male lamb in its first year without a blemish as a burnt offering. Then a female lamb in its first year without a blemish as a sin offering. Lachatos, as a sin offering. Va'ayil echad tomim le'shlomim. And then you have to offer up a ram, a shlomim offering. So this is an explosion, because why does a Nazir have to bring a sin offering? And for that we have like one side we have the Ramban, Nachmanides passed away 1270, and on the other side we have Maimonides, the Rambam, and one says it's brilliant to be a Nazir, and one says it's the most terrible thing to be a Nazir. Come with me. Well, I will qualify what I says in a minute. So source 6. This is Nachmanides, the Rambam. And the reason that the Nazir must bring a sin offering is not explained in the Torah. It just says, lo nisparesh, there's no explanation. Va'al derech hapshat, ki ha'ish hazeh, the man or the woman, according to the simple meaning of the text, choter nafsho bimlo'oth nazirus. According to the Ramban Nachmanides, the big sin the Nazir does is not that he or she became a Nazir in the first place, is because when he finishes becoming a Nazir, he or she, always he or she, in case I say he, that's his sin, because he's gone back to normal life. According to the Ramban, he's now holds back from his elevated status of being a Nazir and holiness to Hashem, and he should forever, it would be more appropriate to forever be a Nazir. And the ideal would be to be a Nazir. And he quotes a pasuk in Amos, Va'okim mibnechem lenevim u'mibachurechem lenazirim. I raised up prophets, it's in bold, from amongst your sons, and Nazirim, from amongst your young men. So the Ramban says, we speak about Nazirim in the same pasuk, and then as Nevi'im, to tell you that a Nazir is the most amazing elevated status. And he says, Hishva oso hakosuf lanovi. He equates a novi to a Nazir. So the whole time that a Nazir is a Nazir, he is Mr. or Mrs. Wonderful. He only requires atonement when he comes out of his status, his elevated status, and says, I'm going back to reality and I'm going back to normal life. One must assume, therefore, that it's not just simple abstention from drinking and abstention from, it's sort of like, as someone said before, maybe self-reflection, a period of abstinence, thinking to yourself, I will be less physical, more spiritual, and that's what the Ramban says. Now, the Maimonides, the Rambam, says something completely different in source 7, and he brings this down in Mishnah Torah Hilchos Deos, and he says, Shema Yoma Odom, Shema Oma Yod Odom, in case like a man would say, and he says, Hakina v'hataiva v'hakovod v'kayotze bohem derech ra'ohem. Because we know from also in Pirkei Avos, seeking glory, jealousy, and desire remove someone from the world. And he says, if a person obsessively separates themselves too much, they can reach an extreme position. So we're told, avoid jealousy, avoid desire, and avoid seeking glory. But if you do that and you basically shrink out of life and out of society, we could find ourselves in an extreme position. And it could happen. And so the person says to themselves, I'm going to move myself. I don't want to be jealous. I don't want to seek glory. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to completely retract from society until they get to a stage, ad shelo yochal basar v'lo yishteh yayin v'lo yisa isha. So they won't eat meat, they won't drink wine, they won't marry, they won't live in comfortable quarters, they won't wear proper clothes, they're just basically going to wear sackcloth. And he says, I don't like the translation I did, but I had to translate it like this, Kagon kohaneha ovdei kochovim, which is basically like other people who serve idols or serve the stars, and I'm translating it as monks, okay? People who are taking celibacy, a vow of celibacy, a person who lives a life with no materialistic path. And this is what the Rambam says.
It's better for the environment if you look
It
at
is
the
better
whole-
than-
the world's
okay.
today,
I know, but can I just say that I'm giving total permission, the Rambam, not me, the Rambam, Maimonides, gives permission that we should eat, we should dress nicely, because he says, look what he says here, Gam ze derech ra'ahi, v'asur leilech bo. One should not live a life of abstinence. We should have, we shouldn't go to the extreme, but we should have, with respect and with honor, to honor ourselves enough to have a decent home, don't live in a shack, don't have decent clothes. We should get married. Celibacy is not the ideal. So the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah Hilchos Deos says, "Hamahalech b'derech zu nikra choter." A person who shrinks back from life and says, "I won't have a house, I won't eat, I won't drink," is considered a sinner. Shaharehu Omer ben Nazir, and he quotes a pasuk which comes in one of the pasukim that I missed out. At the end, the priest has to offer up a sin offering, echad lachatos, echad laola, v'chiper olav, and atone for him. This is source 8. Me'asher chata al hanefesh. Now I'm going to talk about that a little bit later because there is something else to say about that. And the Rambam is using this as his proof pasuk to say, you see, at the end of the term of a Nazir, he has to offer up a sin offering because he has done a sin against himself and against society. He has retracted, he has had no involvement perhaps in society, he hasn't enjoyed the pleasures of drinking wine, he hasn't got married, that is a sin according to the Rambam. I have to give you some more information about being intellectually honest afterwards, but before I do that, I just want you to go with me and see what else the Rambam says in source 9. And he says, the Rambam says there is something called Shvil HaZahav, the golden middle way. He loves the golden middle way. And he says, if you have, let's say for example, I have a tendency to be very stingy, how do I get myself? You don't want to be at this extreme over here. So if I find myself to be stingy, I don't want to get to the golden middle path of being generous, but without being so generous that I'm completely profligate and I'm spending all my money and I don't care if my children don't have any money for food because I'm generous. So, but if you know within yourself, you have within yourself the tendency to be stingy, you should move yourself to giving away as much as possible so you'll sort of get yourself into the middle path. And Rambam is very big on that. And he says, for example, restraint is the middle path between indulgence and completely having no desire in your life. But there, you can have stinginess and extravagance, so you've got to get to generosity. But the Rambam does have a caveat, and he says there are a few things that we have to completely never, ever, ever do, and that is we must never be too haughty. Keep away from it. There's no such thing as a golden middle way. We must never incorporate anger in our lives, improper speech, making fun of anyone, or being greedy. Those don't need the golden middle way. You just need to keep away from those things.
Does that apply to the commandments, that you find the middle way, that you don't be extreme in how...
But what do you mean by the commandments?
So in terms of, I'll give you a perfect example about men and women not shaking hands.
Yeah.
But if a non-Jewish woman gives out her hand because she doesn't know, the man should shake her hand, not to embarrass her, so by not deliberately embarrassing.
I'm not going to be able to answer that question because I wouldn't say what the halacha is, and I think people have to decide for themselves. But let's say, for example, if it would be a very pious rabbi, he would just sort of say, like, I'm so sorry, when I put myself in a situation where I'm going to meet someone and I know that it's going to be so awkward, I make sure that I'm carrying the most ridiculous thing. Either I find, a child, or I know that I'm going to meet them, so I know I'm about to come in, so I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, I've just put my hands on the cake or whatever, and I just say, I'm sorry, I've got cake, and then I just avoid
that once, and I didn't realise he was a rabbi. This guy I knew, grew up with, he was like a youth leader, and I said, oh hi, how are you? He goes, you do know I'm a rabbi now. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, but you know that, but because I thought that you're not allowed to embarrass, that is the actual halakha.
You should not embarrass someone, even though you should even be killed almost before embarrassing.
The kind of the fence.
I don't know. I tell you what, we'll leave that for Rabbi Levine when he comes. We'll ask him. Okay.
The thing is, it important to say that one can strive to do something, but to avoid negative behavior. But there's a distinction between doing that say I want to learn Daf every day,
Yeah.
but I'm not taking a Nazirite vow that I'm going to learn Daf. I can say, yes, I'm going to try this.
Well, I'll just stop you there for a second. On Yom Kippur, before we even go into Yom Kippur, we say Kol Nidrei, because the importance, the actual gravitas of making a vow, it's not just like, you can't say, I promise you, or I swear I'm gonna, you shouldn't even say that. You should say Bli Neder, because you should be very, very careful, because what words come out our mouths, davar and dibur is the same. A matter, a thing, a substance, something is the same as words. Don't think, we have like the written word, but like verbal contracts, written contracts, if anybody's here into law, but words are very powerful. So I'm glad that you mentioned that about taking the vow.
But there's a distinction between voicing an intention and pursuing an intention and being a Nazir, where you say,
But when
I will definitely do that, or I promise I'll do that, or, again, the Bli Neder is, to have it in mind that, yes, I'm undertaking this, but Bli Neder.
Okay, but the Targum says ki yafli, specifically translates it as articulates, clearly expressed, spoken. It has to be spoken. So we really have to think about the importance of words. Okay, let's go on. I do want to just make a caveat that the Maimonides, the Rambam, who I'm telling you is the golden middle path, and the Nazir is a sinner, and who's given us full permission to enjoy life, okay? Because we're supposed to, we should not, we're called a sinner if we abstain from life and retract. The Rambam does say somewhere else, it's not on your sheet, on Hilchos Nazirus 10:14, if anyone wants to look it up, anyone who vows to God to become a Nazirite by way of holiness does well, and it is praiseworthy. Hanoded Lashem derech kedusha harei zeh no'eh u'meshubach. He does say that. Now this leads to a very fascinating discussion which Rabbi Jonathan Sachs speaks about. If you read a couple of years ago, he wrote in Covenant Conversation. He says, and I'm going to read it to you because no way can I do justice to his words if I just say them myself. He says, the aim of moral life to achieve personal perfection, or is it to create a decent, just, and compassionate society? So should a person say, I care about myself, and I only have to care, put myself in a cupboard, lock myself up, be a hermit up top of the mountain, I won't speak Lashon Hara, I'll never eat anything kosher because I'm never going to go anywhere, and I'll just learn Torah by myself? Or does a person have to live in society and say, I'm maybe the biggest expert of learning Torah, but I want to increase my Torah? Or should I say, well, actually, if you're the biggest expert, you should share it. If you are an expert in something, you should not just sit in a cupboard in a mountain by yourself with sheep. You should really come out into society and join society. Look what he says. The intuitive answer of most people would be to say both. We should join society and achieve perfection as much possible as possible. That's what makes Rambam, Maimonides, so acute a thinker. He realizes that you cannot have both. A person cannot make themselves into a saint where they've sort of put themselves as a hermit in the middle of nowhere, no interaction with society. You cannot have both. They are in fact different enterprises. A saint may give all his money away to the poor, but what about the members of the saint's own family? A saint may refuse to fight in the battle. Well, that's fine for him, but what if we all decided we're all going to be saints? Who's going to defend the country? A saint may forgive all the crimes committed against him, but what about the rules of law and justice? Saints are supremely virtuous people and can be virtuous as individuals, yet you cannot build a society out of saints alone. Ultimately, saints are not really interested in society. Their concern is the salvation of the soul, and I would say self-preservation of the soul, right? A sage, and Rabbi Sachs, Zichron Levrach, says that's a chacham, a wise person, is not an extremist because he or she realizes there are other people at stake. There are members of one's own family and within one's own community. There's a country to defend and an economy to sustain. Imagine you just lock yourself up there. You're not earning a living because you're not going to interact with anybody. You're not going to do anything. The sage knows he or she cannot leave all these commitments behind to pursue a life of solitary virtue. For we are called upon by Hashem to live in the world, not escape from it, to exist in society, not seclusion, to strive to create a balance amongst the conflicting pressures on us, not to focus on some whilst neglecting others. Maimonides, the Rambam, was a sage, a chacham, who longed to be a saint. He knew he couldn't be because he was a doctor in Fustat, and every day there's like a story of his life, and he's written a letter to Ibn Tibbon, and he says, I get up early in the morning, I have to do my prayers, I have to be there when the community opens up, I've got to be a doctor, there are queues of people waiting to see me, and only then at the end of a whole day I hardly even have enough time to eat, because he knew that he had to honor his responsibilities to his people. And I found that very, very, very sad that Rambam, Maimonides, who in his lifetime gave us so much, he was at conflict. He knew, I want to lock myself up in a cupboard and improve myself. And some people perhaps feel like that, but he himself thinks that maybe is, in inverted commas, the ideal, but he also knows that maybe it's not an ideal, because if the people who are the creme de la creme of the society want to improve themselves, they're saints, they lock themselves up and they're hermits and they don't share with society. And I found that so moving.
I hate to say it, but it makes me think of all this yeshivot where you have so many people who are not the creme de la creme, who are the great learners who are passing it on. They're just learning for learning's sake.
So perhaps according to what Maimonides says is that we have to have some people who sustain the society, people who do PhDs in remote subjects. That's fine. That's fine. But I'm saying though is then publish your articles. Publish your articles. So if you want to, let's say I'm going to be yeshiva for 10 years, I'm investing in my education. Even if it would be like, lahavdil, a tennis player, you want to be the best tennis player, the best tennis coach, you have to invest. So there's nothing wrong with investing, but not for a lifetime, because ultimately, if that was an ideal and we were all a Nazir, we would separate ourselves, and we would all, and I think that is much more interesting for me in terms of not actually what the laws of a Nazir are, but like what it would be like if everyone says, you know what, I'm going to do that, and then no one functions in society.
Sorry, but I thought we said at the beginning that the Nazir does not separate.
He doesn't separate. I'm saying that there are people who might say to themselves, I'm not talking about celibacy, because that's not a Jewish ideal.
No, not celibacy, separate himself.
But some people do that because some people feel, the Yaakov-Esav dynamic. Yaakov instinctively was Ishtom Yoshev Oholim. He wanted to be a person who sat in his tent all day. And Esav was more the man of the field. But Yaakov had to come out of his shell in order to be the next person who was leading the Jewish people. He had to have that balance of a person who perhaps felt they belonged in the field to try, take yourself an hour or two a day for self-reflection and self-study rather than, but not your whole life so that you're not in society. Because, even the Rambam says, then we have Jonathan Sachs says, I don't know if he said it in the name of the Rambam, that if everybody says I want to be a saint and sit at home, then no one's going to be an optician, and no one's going to work in the army. We wouldn't have doctors, and it's all fantastic. So let's move on, because I want to get to some other things. We've got like 5 minutes anyway. Okay, we'll try. Okay, Rashi says, what is the sin against the soul? Back to source 8, with the Rambam quoted at the top of page 3. What is the sin against the soul? And he says that because maybe he became contaminated against a soul, i.e. against a dead body, that's his sin, he became contaminated. And Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says his sin consists of the fact that he afflicted himself by abstaining from wine. So according to Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, he says he's made a sin because he's separated from wine, which is not good for me because I don't drink wine. And the Sifsei Chachamim, which is the super commentary on Rashi, says, passed away 1718, Amsterdam, he says this implies, according to Rashi, that there's a sin to abstain from wine, which some people will be really happy to hear that implies that there was a transgression. The transgression the Nazir did was that he abstained from wine. And the Sifsei Chachamim says it's certainly a mitzvah to take the Nazir vow. Sorry, it's certainly a mitzvah, according to the Sifsei Chachamim, to take the Nazir vow against wine. But nonetheless, and his words are, Aval mikol makom, avera katsashu, shetzier atzmo min hayayin. Might be a big, fantastic mitzvah that you're a Nazir, but within that mitzvah, you are doing a minor sin of abstaining from wine. So Interesting.
Wine, is it grape juice as well?
Wine, grape juice, anything, okay? So, now I'm going to talk about something that Jane said before. So the Gemara in Tanis, source 12 says, if the Nazir who holds himself back from abstaining from wine is called a sinner, how much more so someone who abstains themselves from other things, source 12, the Gemara in Tanis, Yod Aleph, how much more so is he considered to be a sinner? And then we have Jane, who quoted the Jerusalem Talmud, Nazir, source 13, Lo dayech, masha asra lacha haTorah. Isn't it enough that the Torah has given us enough things to have restrictions, that you need to find yourself something else to take upon yourself, to forbid yourself something else? Perhaps a Nazir took upon himself the abstention or retraction from life, a withdrawal for a limited time. Maybe he felt he was like losing control. Maybe it was meditation. Maybe it was sort of like, I'm going to do this. Do we need to take a Nazir vow? Maybe a person can say, you know what? I'm going to do a detox. I'm going to cut out sugar. Perhaps I'm not going to say that because I don't drink wine. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, source 14, I brought it for you. Moral life is not always simple, not always a matter of black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. It usually is, but not always. Okay, but from the perspective of Jewish faith as a whole, I missed that bit. Viewed from the perspective of personal perfection, the Nazir is good and holy. But from the perspective of Jewish faith as a whole, such a life is not ideal. Judaism wants us to celebrate life, not retreat from it. It is holy to retreat from the world and its challenges, but it is holier still to engage with them. And I'd like to finish by saying, in Bereshis, when we are commanded to not eat from the tree of life, we are told, before we're even told not to eat from the fruit tree, the first command we're told in Perek Beis Tesayin, which is source 15 on the sheet, Vayitzav Hashem Elokim es ha'odom leimor. Hashem commanded, Mikol eitz hagan ochol tochel. You have to eat from every fruit of the tree in the garden. And I'm going to tell you, this is not on your sheet, the Gemara, the Talmud Yerushalmi says, Osid odom litain din v'cheshbon al kol ma she'rosa ve'eino v'lo ochal. In the future, a person has to justify himself in front of Hashem for everything his eyes saw and which he did not eat. And I don't know whether that means eating food, so you should eat, I don't know, exotic fruit like dragon fruit or something like that, or countries you haven't visited. And on that note, I could only find the source in a very interesting book, and I'm not recommending the book because I don't know who this Rabbi David Wolper is, but I just found the actual words and I'm giving it to you because the story is fantastic. In his final years, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch told his students, he lived in Germany, and I think he passed away in 1888, and he said to his students, I'm going to see the Swiss Alps. And they thought to himself, are you crazy? He spent his whole life learning and teaching, and he says, when I go up to Hashem at the age of 120, and Hashem says to me, Nu Shimshon, what did you think of my Alps? What will I say to him? When you see something so beautiful, Hashem has put beautiful things in the world. Go to see the beautiful places in the world. Go and see. We are not put in the world to be hermits. Obviously, some people may want to, but we are supposed to be in this world to engage. So according to the Maimonides, it is not correct to abstain, and I've given you full permission to buy a new outfit and to have a nice drink tonight. Whatever, I'm not giving the permission, the Rambam is. And to think to yourself, how from the Nazir, who perhaps, according to the Nachmanides, it's an ideal, but perhaps we have to think to ourselves that really Hashem wants us to engage in the world. We should live in the world and enjoy. And we don't have to overindulge. You don't have to drink so much that you are drunk and you get into difficult situations. And you don't have to buy so much stuff that you don't have any money for other people who need your charity. But there's a balance. And so I would like to say, Ochal tochal, you've got to eat the fruits of the trees. And you've got to eat all interesting things, not We've got to separate. We've got to keep ourselves kadoshim. We've got to separate from our vera and our rayas, from immorality, but we have to enjoy. Hashem gave us beautiful things, and that is my excuse to go on holidays and see beautiful places, and to go to restaurants and to enjoy things. And I hope all of you have the most wonderful opportunity to travel and to see, and to, like Shimshon, to go and see the beautiful the Swiss Alps. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Thank you so much.